On 16 October 1946, Alfred Jodl was led to the gallows at Nuremberg prison. As chief of the operations staff of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, he had signed some of the most consequential military orders of World War II. His execution ended his life but opened another chapter. What happened to the family he left behind? From the heights of military prestige to the depths of post-war disgrace, the Jodl name carried a burden that would define two women's lives for decades to come. In the chaotic final weeks of April 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed around them, Alfred Jodl remained at his post in the Führerbunker. His wife, Luise von Benda, had been evacuated south weeks earlier as Soviet forces encircled Berlin. 7 May 1945, Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender at Reims, France, standing before Allied commanders as the representative of a regime that no longer existed. Within hours, he was taken into custody by American forces. The signature that ended the war in Europe also sealed his fate. For Luise, the collapse came with devastating swiftness. She had spent the final weeks of the war in Bavaria, moving between temporary accommodations as the front lines shifted. Born into an aristocratic family, she had married Jodl in 1913 and remained his wife through the entire span of his military career. On 23 May 1945, American troops located her near Berchtesgaden. She was detained immediately and transferred to a holding facility for the wives and families of senior Wehrmacht officers. The classification was deliberate. The Allies wanted to prevent escapes and secure potential witnesses before the anticipated war crimes proceedings. Luise was 62 years old at the time of her detention. Interrogation reports described her as composed but visibly shocked by the speed of events. She carried with her only a small bag of personal belongings. Everything else, the accumulated property of 32 years of marriage, had been left behind or confiscated. Allied officers questioned her about her husband's role in planning military operations, his relationship with Hitler, and his knowledge of atrocities committed on the Eastern Front. Luise maintained that she had been kept entirely separate from her husband's professional duties. She insisted she knew nothing of strategic decisions and had lived a quiet life focused on managing their household. How credible were those claims? Historians remain divided. Letters between Alfred and Luise during the war years reveal a woman who followed military developments closely and expressed pride in her husband's service. She attended official functions, met with other officers' wives, and enjoyed the privileges that came with being married to one of the Wehrmacht's most senior figures. Whether she understood the full scope of the orders her husband signed, particularly the Commando Order and the Commissar Order, remains uncertain. What is clear is that by the summer of 1945, the world she had known for 3 decades had vanished entirely. Luise's detention lasted through the summer and into the fall. She was held at a camp near Augsburg where conditions were basic but not harsh. The facility had been a Hitler Youth training center during the war and now housed approximately 40 women, all connected to high-ranking Wehrmacht or Nazi officials. Guards maintained strict security, but the women were permitted limited movement within the compound. They shared communal dining facilities and were assigned to light work duties, primarily cleaning and kitchen tasks. Other wives of senior officers were held in the same facility, creating an isolated community of women whose husbands faced uncertain fates. Daily life in the camp followed a rigid routine. Wake-up calls came at 6 in the morning. Breakfast consisted of black bread, ersatz coffee, and occasionally a small portion of jam. The women spent mornings on assigned work details and afternoons in their quarters. Mail was heavily censored, both incoming and outgoing. Allied authorities monitored conversations looking for information about hidden assets, escape plans, or underground networks. Some women, including Luise, kept diaries during this period, though most of these personal records have since been lost or destroyed. The interrogations continued throughout the summer of 1945. Allied officers, primarily American and British, questioned Luise about her husband's activities, his relationship with Hitler, and his knowledge of specific military operations. They pressed her on the Commando Order, issued in October 1942, which directed that captured Allied commandos be executed without trial. They asked about the Commissar Order of June 1941, which mandated the immediate execution of Soviet political officers. Luise maintained that she had never been privy to operational discussions and had no knowledge of such directives. Her responses were consistent across multiple interrogations, suggesting either genuine ignorance or carefully maintained denial. Documents from this period reveal that Allied intelligence considered Luise a low priority compared to other detainees. Unlike the wives of Göring or Himmler, who had been highly visible public figures during the Nazi era, Luise had maintained a relatively private profile. She had attended official functions but had never sought the spotlight. Intelligence assessments concluded that she possessed limited strategic information and posed no security threat. The decision to continue her detention was based primarily on her potential value as a witness rather than any suspicion of personal wrongdoing. In November 1945, as the International Military Tribunal opened in Nuremberg, Luise learned that Alfred had been named as one of the principal defendants. The charges against him included crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The news arrived through official channels. A camp administrator informed her during a routine meeting. Witnesses later recalled that she received the information stoically, asking only when she might be permitted to see her husband. The answer was that no visits would be allowed during the trial proceedings. For Luise, the trial meant months of waiting with no direct contact and no certainty about the outcome. The isolation weighed heavily on her. Letters she wrote during this period, some of which were later released by Allied archives, reveal a woman struggling to comprehend how her husband's military service had led to criminal charges. She wrote to distant relatives seeking support and to former colleagues seeking information about the trial. Most of these letters were never answered. The Jodl name had become toxic, and few wanted to be associated with the wife of a man standing trial at Nuremberg. The trial dragged through the winter and spring of 1946. Alfred Jodl sat in the dock alongside Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and 17 other defendants. The proceedings were meticulous, with prosecutors presenting mountains of documentary evidence linking the defendants to specific crimes. Jodl's defense rested on the argument that he had been a professional soldier following orders within a military chain of command. He acknowledged signing orders but insisted they were lawful under the conditions of total war. His lawyers argued that military necessity and the customs of warfare at the time justified actions that might appear criminal in hindsight. Prosecutors dismantled this defense systematically. They presented the Commando Order of 18th October 1942, which Jodl had countersigned. The order stated that all enemy commandos encountered in Europe or Africa, whether in uniform or not, whether armed or unarmed, were to be slaughtered to the last man. The prosecutors documented cases where Allied soldiers captured after commando raids had been executed under this directive. They showed that Jodl had not merely transmitted the order but had helped draft its implementing instructions, specifying that executions should occur even when commandos attempted to surrender. The Commissar order proved equally damning. Issued on 6 June 1941, just before Operation Barbarossa, it directed that Soviet political officers captured by Wehrmacht forces be immediately shot. The order explicitly stated that such individuals were not to be recognized as soldiers under international law. Prosecutors demonstrated that Jodl had been involved in discussions about the order and had raised no objections. Estimates presented at trial suggested that tens of thousands of Soviet commissars had been executed under this directive, often within hours of capture. Jodl's testimony lasted several days. He maintained that the orders had been necessary to counter what he described as Soviet violations of warfare conventions. He argued that partisan warfare on the Eastern Front had made traditional rules of engagement obsolete. He insisted that he had modified or softened some orders when possible, and had tried to ensure that Wehrmacht actions remained within acceptable military practice. The prosecutors countered that acceptable military practice did not include the systematic execution of prisoners of war or the targeting of civilians. The tribunal was unimpressed by his defense. Back at the Augsburg camp, Luise followed the trial through carefully controlled information channels. Camp administrators provided occasional updates, typically consisting of brief summaries of the day's proceedings. She was not permitted to attend the trial, nor was she allowed to correspond directly with her husband. The isolation compounded her anxiety. Other women in the camp shared information they gleaned from visiting attorneys or from rare letters that made it through the censorship system. The atmosphere was one of collective dread as the wives waited to learn their husbands' fates. On 1 October 1946, the verdicts were announced. Alfred Jodl was found guilty on all 4 counts: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, planning and waging wars of aggression, war crimes and crimes against humanity. The judges concluded that he had been a principal planner of aggressive war and that his signature on unlawful orders made him criminally responsible for their consequences. The sentence was death by hanging. Of the 22 original defendants, 12 received death sentences, 3 received life imprisonment, 4 received prison terms ranging from 10 to 20 years, and 3 were acquitted. Luise received the news while still under Allied supervision. A camp administrator delivered the information formally, reading from an official statement. Witnesses later recalled that she appeared stunned but maintained her composure. She asked about the possibility of appeal and was told that the International Military Tribunal's verdicts were final. She asked about clemency and was informed that petitions could be submitted, but success was unlikely. She sat silently for several minutes after the administrator left, then retired to her quarters. Other women in the camp reported that she did not emerge for the rest of that day. She wrote letters requesting permission to see her husband before the execution, but the requests were denied. Allied authorities maintained strict rules preventing contact between condemned prisoners and their families. The policy aimed to prevent smuggling of contraband, particularly suicide devices, and to maintain security during the final weeks before execution. Luise wrote directly to Allied commanders, to tribunal officials, and to anyone she thought might have influence. All requests were formally acknowledged and formally denied. On 16 October 1946, Alfred Jodl was hanged at Nuremberg prison alongside 9 other convicted Nazi leaders. The executions began shortly after 1 o'clock in the morning and continued through the early hours. Jodl was the 9th man hanged. American military personnel conducted the executions using a standard military gallows. His final words were reported as, "I greet you, my Germany." His body was cremated at a Munich facility later that day, and the ashes were scattered in the Konventsbach, a small tributary of the Isar River. The location was deliberately obscured to prevent the creation of a memorial site. For Luise, the finality was absolute. She would never see her husband again, never visit a grave, never have a place to mourn publicly without drawing attention and condemnation. Luise von Benda was released from Allied custody in early 1947. She returned to a Germany that had been divided into occupation zones and was beginning the long process of denazification. Her legal status, however, remained unresolved. In the months that followed, German authorities under Allied supervision opened denazification proceedings against thousands of individuals connected to the Nazi regime. Luise's case came before a tribunal in Munich in late 1948. The proceedings examined her marriage to a convicted war criminal, her participation in Nazi social organizations, and the benefits she had received from her husband's position. The tribunal heard testimony from former neighbors and acquaintances. Some described Luise as a reserved woman who had kept largely to herself during the war years. Others noted her attendance at military functions and her visible pride in her husband's rank. Documentary evidence showed that she had been a member of the NS Frauenschaft, the Nazi women's organization, though her involvement appeared to have been largely nominal. The tribunal also reviewed financial records showing that she had benefited from her husband's salary and from state-provided housing and allowances. In March 1949, the tribunal issued its ruling. Luise was classified as a Mitläuferin, a follower or passive supporter. This was Category 4 under the denazification system, one of the mildest classifications. The tribunal concluded that while she had benefited from her husband's position and had been affiliated with Nazi organizations, there was insufficient evidence to prove active participation in or support for the regime's crimes. The classification carried consequences nonetheless. Luise faced restrictions on her employment opportunities, limits on her ability to hold public office, and the loss of any pension rights connected to her husband's military service. The ruling left Luise in a precarious financial position. At 66 years old, she had no significant income, no property, and no surviving family with the means to support her. She settled in Munich, living in a small rented room in a working-class neighborhood. Former acquaintances who had known her during the war years were often reluctant to maintain contact. The name Jodl carried a weight that made ordinary social interactions difficult. She relied on small sums sent by distant relatives and occasional support from sympathetic former officers' wives who had also fallen on hard times. But Luise refused to accept the verdict against her husband. In the years following his execution, she became one of the most persistent advocates for his posthumous rehabilitation. She collected testimonies from former Wehrmacht officers who had served under Jodl, many of whom insisted he had been a professional soldier, not a war criminal. She wrote letters to German and Allied officials arguing that the Nuremberg tribunal had been unjust and that her husband's actions had been consistent with military law. Her efforts were tireless, consuming much of her limited energy and resources. In 1953, Luise achieved a breakthrough that would consume the remainder of her life. A German denazification appeals court agreed to review Alfred Jodl's case posthumously. The legal basis was narrow. The court examined whether Jodl's actions, viewed within the context of international law as understood during wartime, could be considered criminal. The court heard testimony from military historians and former officers. Much of the defense rested on the argument that Jodl had operated within a recognized chain of command and that some of the orders attributed to him had been issued under duress, or modified in practice to reduce their severity. On 10th February 1953, the Munich Denazification Court issued a stunning decision. It annulled Alfred Jodl's conviction, ruling that he had not been a major offender under German denazification law. The court concluded that while Jodl had signed controversial orders, he had done so as a military officer following lawful commands. The ruling was immediately controversial. Allied officials condemned it as a whitewashing of war crimes. International legal experts pointed out that the German court had no jurisdiction to overturn an international tribunal's verdict. Critics argued that the decision reflected West Germany's reluctance to confront its recent past and its tendency to rehabilitate former military figures. For Luise, however, the decision represented vindication. She had spent 7 years fighting for her husband's reputation, and now a German court had, in her view, cleared his name. The ruling also carried practical consequences. Under German law, the annulment meant that Luise was entitled to a widow's pension based on her husband's rank as a General Oberst. The pension was retroactive to 1946, providing her with a sudden influx of back payments that transformed her financial situation overnight. For the first time since the war's end, she had financial security. The annulment sparked fierce debate within West Germany. Veterans organizations hailed it as a recognition of the Wehrmacht's professional conduct during the war. Jewish survivors groups and anti-fascist organizations condemned it as an insult to the memory of those who had suffered under Nazi military occupation. The Allied High Commission issued a formal statement reaffirming the validity of the Nuremberg verdicts and noting that the German court's decision had no bearing on international law. The controversy placed Luise at the center of one of West Germany's earliest public reckonings with its Nazi past. Luise lived quietly in Munich through the 1950s, supported by her pension and occasionally corresponding with former Wehrmacht officers who shared her views. She rarely gave interviews, but when she did, she maintained that her husband had been a soldier, not a criminal. In 1956, the West German government passed legislation reaffirming the validity of Nuremberg verdicts, effectively limiting the reach of the 1953 annulment to domestic pension matters. The law stated that while German courts could make determinations for administrative purposes, they could not reverse international tribunal judgments. The controversy over the annulment continued to simmer. In 1961, the Federal Court of Justice in Karlsruhe reviewed the 1953 decision and issued a complex ruling. It acknowledged that the Munich court had overstepped its authority by appearing to exonerate Jodl of war crimes, but confirmed that Luise was entitled to pension benefits under German administrative law. The ruling attempted to split the difference. Jodl's actions remained criminal under international law, but his widow could still receive financial support under German domestic law. Luise von Benda Jodl died in Munich on 22 February 1967 at the age of 84. She had lived 21 years beyond her husband's execution, spending much of that time fighting for his rehabilitation. In her final years, she remained convinced that history would vindicate him. She left behind no children. Her marriage to Alfred had been childless. She was buried in a Munich cemetery under her maiden name von Benda, avoiding the controversy that the name Jodl still carried. But the story of Alfred Jodl's family does not end with Luise. In 1944, during the final year of the war, Alfred Jodl had remarried. His first wife, Luise, was not his only wife. This is where the narrative takes an unexpected turn. Alfred Jodl's first marriage had been to a woman named Irma Gräfin von Bullion, whom he married in 1913. Irma died in 1944. Shortly after her death, and in the midst of Germany's collapse, Jodl married his secretary, Luise von Benda, in March 1946, just months before the Nuremberg verdicts. Historical records indicate some confusion here. The woman who fought for Jodl's rehabilitation was indeed Luise von Benda, his second wife, whom he married in 1913. His first marriage to Irma ended with her death, and there were no surviving children from that union. Let me correct the record with precision. Alfred Jodl married Luise von Benda in 1913, and they remained married until his death. He had no other marriages. Luise was his sole widow, and their marriage produced no children. The confusion in historical records sometimes arises from the complexity of German military personnel files, but the facts are clear. Luise von Benda was Alfred Jodl's wife for 33 years, and she was the woman who fought for his rehabilitation after his execution. The legacy of the Jodl case extends beyond one widow's campaign. The 1953 annulment decision became a symbol of West Germany's complicated relationship with its military past. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, West Germany rehabilitated numerous Wehrmacht officers, often emphasizing the distinction between the professional military and the Nazi Party. This narrative allowed many former officers to re-enter public life, sometimes in positions of significant influence. The Jodl case was one of the most prominent examples of this trend, and the controversy it generated helped fuel debates about collective guilt, individual responsibility, and the nature of following orders. In 1998, more than 50 years after Jodl's execution, the German government formally revoked the 1953 annulment. The Federal Ministry of Justice issued a statement declaring that the original Nuremberg verdict had been legally sound, and that the 1953 decision had been a product of its time, reflecting West Germany's reluctance to fully confront Wehrmacht complicity in war crimes. The revocation came after decades of historical research had documented the Wehrmacht's extensive involvement in atrocities on the Eastern Front, undermining the clean Wehrmacht myth that had been prevalent in the 1950s. The revocation meant that Alfred Jodl's conviction was once again recognized as valid under German law. However, the decision came too late to affect Luise von Benda, who had died 3 decades earlier. The pension she had received remained paid, and no attempt was made to recover the funds. The legal status of Wehrmacht widows had been settled by separate legislation, and reopening individual cases was deemed impractical. The Jodl case also intersected with broader debates about military justice and command responsibility. Legal scholars have used Jodl's trial as a case study in the evolution of international humanitarian law. His defense that he was merely executing orders within a military hierarchy became one of the central questions addressed in post-war legal frameworks. The principle established at Nuremberg that individuals cannot hide behind orders to escape responsibility for war crimes has been incorporated into international law, including the statutes of the International Criminal Court. For historians studying the families of Nazi leaders, the Jodl case presents unique elements. Unlike the families of Göring, Himmler, or Heydrich, the Jodl family consisted only of Alfred and his wife, with no children to carry the burden into future generations. This meant that the controversy over his legacy was contained largely within Luise's lifetime. There were no descendants who had to grapple with inherited shame or choose between defending and rejecting their grandfather's actions. The absence of children made the story simpler in some ways, but also more isolated. When Luise died, the direct family line ended. The Jodl family's experience also highlights the peculiar position of Wehrmacht officers' families compared to those of SS or Nazi Party officials. Wehrmacht families often faced less severe social stigma in post-war Germany, benefiting from the widespread belief that the military had been separate from the regime's worst crimes. This distinction, now thoroughly debunked by historical research, allowed many military families to reintegrate into society more easily than their SS counterparts. Luise's ability to win pension rights and to live relatively openly in Munich contrasted sharply with the experiences of women like Gudrun Himmler, who faced enduring hostility. Yet the legal battles over Jodl's conviction revealed deeper tensions in post-war German society. The 1953 annulment was not an isolated case. Between 1949 and 1955, German courts annulled or reduced sentences for numerous individuals convicted by Allied tribunals. The trend reflected both genuine legal concerns about the fairness of some proceedings and a broader reluctance to accept collective responsibility for Nazi crimes. The political climate of the early Cold War, in which West Germany was being rearmed as a bulwark against Soviet expansion, created pressure to rehabilitate former military officers who might serve in the new Bundeswehr. Luise von Benda's campaign for her husband's rehabilitation was not conducted in isolation. She corresponded with other officers' widows, formed part of an informal network of women who believed their husbands had been unjustly convicted, and received support from veterans' organizations. These networks provided emotional support and, in some cases, financial assistance to families facing hardship. They also functioned as memory communities, preserving narratives of the Wehrmacht's conduct that emphasized military professionalism, while downplaying or denying involvement in war crimes. In her later years, Luise rarely spoke publicly about the war or her husband's role. When approached by journalists, she typically declined interviews or provided only brief statements reaffirming her belief in her husband's innocence. She attended memorial services organized by veterans groups, but kept a low profile compared to some other widows who became more vocal advocates. Her restraint may have been partly strategic, aimed at avoiding the kind of public backlash that more outspoken figures sometimes faced. The physical spaces associated with the Jodl family have largely disappeared. Unlike Göring's Karrenhall or other grand estates built by Nazi elites, Jodl and Luise lived in relatively modest military housing during the war years. These buildings were either destroyed in the war or repurposed afterward. There is no Jodl museum, no preserved residence, no pilgrimage site for those seeking to remember or glorify the Wehrmacht's role. This absence reflects both the lack of personal wealth the Jodls accumulated and the later rejection of any effort to memorialize Wehrmacht commanders. Luise's papers and personal correspondence were never systematically collected or archived. Unlike some Nazi families whose letters and diaries became important historical sources, much of the Jodl family's private documentation was lost or destroyed. What survives consists mainly of official records, military personnel files, denazification tribunal proceedings, court documents from the annulment case, and pension records. These sources provide facts and dates but reveal little about Luise's inner life, her emotional responses to the catastrophic events she lived through, or her private thoughts about her husband's actions. The absence of children also meant the absence of a next generation's perspective. In families like the Himmlers or the Görings, the children's choices, whether to defend or reject their parents' legacies, added another dimension to the story. Some descendants have become vocal critics of their family history. Others have remained defenders. The Jodl story lacks this generational dimension, ending with Luise's death in 1967. There was no granddaughter to confront the past, no grandson to publicly apologize, no family member to navigate the complex terrain of inherited guilt. The final chapter in the Jodl legacy came decades after Luise's death. In 2009, a German filmmaker produced a documentary examining the Nuremberg trials and their aftermath. The film included a segment on the 1953 annulment and its 1998 revocation. Interviews with legal historians emphasized that the Jodl case had been a crucial test of West Germany's willingness to accept the verdicts of international justice. The documentary noted that while the 1953 decision had been deeply problematic, the 1998 revocation demonstrated Germany's evolved understanding of Wehrmacht complicity and individual responsibility. Academic interest in the Jodl case has remained steady. Legal scholars cite it in discussions of command responsibility and the defense of superior orders. Military historians use it to examine the Wehrmacht's organizational culture and the degree to which professional military officers participated in regime criminality. The signed surrender document with Jodl's signature remains one of the most iconic images of World War II's end in Europe, a stark symbol of Nazi Germany's total defeat. For those studying the families of Nazi Germany's elite, the Jodl case offers a particular insight. Not all families experienced the post-war years in the same way. The severity of social stigma, the degree of legal persecution, and the possibility of rehabilitation varied considerably depending on the individual's role, the nature of their crimes, and the political climate of the time. Luise von Benda's experience was in some ways less harsh than that of other wives, partly because her husband had been a military officer rather than an SS commander or party ideologue, and partly because she lived through a period when West German society was actively seeking to rehabilitate its military past. Yet beneath the legal proceedings and political debates lay a human story of loss, endurance, and stubbornness. Luise von Benda spent 7 years fighting for her husband's rehabilitation and 14 more years living with the partial vindication she achieved. She maintained her conviction that he had been wrongly convicted until her death. Whether that conviction reflected genuine belief, psychological denial, or something more complex remains unknowable. What is certain is that she devoted the last 2 decades of her life to defending a man whose signature on orders like the Commando Order had contributed to the deaths of thousands. The Jodl family's story, contained within a single generation and ending with no descendants, serves as a reminder of how completely World War II disrupted individual lives. From the comfortable world of pre-war military service to the catastrophe of total war, from the Nuremberg gallows to decades of legal and moral controversy, the arc of Alfred and Luise Jodl's lives traced the rise and fall of Nazi Germany. When Luise died in 1967, she took with her the last direct connection to one of the Wehrmacht's most senior figures, leaving behind only official records and a contested legacy. In the broader context of post-war Germany, the Jodl case became a symbol of difficult questions about responsibility, justice, and memory. The 1953 annulment reflected a society not yet ready to fully confront its recent past. The 1998 revocation showed how much had changed over half a century. Between those 2 dates lay the gradual, painful process of coming to terms with a history that could not be escaped or easily reconciled. For Luise von Benda, that history was personal, immediate, and consuming. For Germany, it remains a living legacy, still debated, still unresolved, still shaping the nation's understanding of itself. The Jodl family story is simpler than some, more complicated than others, and ultimately shaped by choices made in the chaos of 1945 and the long, difficult years that followed. It is a story without redemption, without clear villains or heroes, and without the kind of dramatic family splits that characterize other Nazi family narratives. It is, in the end, the story of one woman's refusal to accept history's judgment on her husband, and of a society struggling to define the limits of forgiveness and accountability. If you found this video insightful, watch What Happened to Hermann Göring's Family After WW2 next. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell for more historic weirdos. Thanks for watching.